Hi, this is Dr. Mercola, and today I'm here with Barbara Loe Fisher, who is the founder of the National Vaccine Information Center, or NVIC, and we are very proud to have been partnering up with Barbara because she is really a pioneer in vaccine education, vaccine safety, and really freedom of choice in whether or not you are going to have the opportunity to refuse or accept vaccinations. So interestingly, in an effort to educate and sort of counterbalance the massive amount of traditional media exposure, which is virtually 100% pro-vaccine, and virtually no mention of the safety or dangers, we co-sponsored with Barb a message that was on in the Times Square on the Jumbotron in March of this year. It was a 15-second spot that ran every hour, 24 hours for several weeks.
For actually 5 weeks.
5 weeks. And it created an enormous amount of controversy. From the American Academy of Pediatrics to CBS, it was really quite a controversial issue. And it ultimately boils down to freedom and liberty, and really central elements of what our whole country is based on. The ability to choose and not be mandated by government who supposedly know better. So I'll let Barb discuss the details because she was really closely involved with it, and really much of the negative press was directed at her organization specifically.
Yes, it was. I was very surprised because this was a really non-controversial 15-second message, which is basically get informed. Make an informed vaccine decision. It's your health, your family, your choice. That very sort of mainstream message of becoming an educated healthcare consumer when it comes to using vaccines or your child using vaccines, that it should cause such a controversy that the American Academy of Pediatrics would write a letter to CBS and put pressure on CBS to take that message down, and they actually leaked the letter to bloggers, who then started a demonization of NVIC, a smear campaign against NVIC, based on the fact that we advocate that people make informed voluntary vaccination decisions. And I protested because, and I wrote a letter to the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics asking why would NVIC be targeted when we for 30 years have been the leading consumer advocates trying to institute safety reforms in the mass vaccination system, trying to encourage everybody to make educated vaccine decisions. If we can't do that in America, if we can't ask people to become educated healthcare consumers, then we're in a pretty sorry state.
Yes, and for those of our viewers who haven't seen or heard of you before, you're recognized as really the leader in this area, and the documentation of that is that the government has actually appointed you to serve as the consumer representative on many government committees that involve vaccine issues.
Well, many years ago, in 1982, when I co-founded the group that's now known as the National Vaccine Information Center, we're a nonprofit charity. We were parents of children who had been injured by DPT vaccine. And our very first goal was to inform parents, inform people that there are risks associated with vaccines, and to institute safety reforms in the system, in the mass vaccination system. So I thought to myself, if I'm going to be a critic of existing policy, I need to understand what that policy is and why the people who recommend it, what they believe. I can't just be a critic from the outside. I have to be willing to sit at the table with people who are making these policies and try to explain to them why the public wants to have more information and wants to have the freedom to make informed vaccine decisions. So I spent more than a quarter century, about 25 years, sitting on vaccine advisor committees, participating in public engagement projects with government in the effort to try to get them to see that people want to be empowered with information and they want to be partners with their doctors in making life and death healthcare decisions for their children. I think this is a responsibility we all have as Americans. If we're going to criticize, we need to get information and we need to be willing to sit at the table and try to convince the people in power they have to change. And for that, the American Academy of Pediatrics goes after me and my organization. I don't think it's right. I think parents expect more from their pediatricians and more from organizations that represent pediatricians than to be attacking parents of vaccine-injured children and parents who are trying to make things better.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And ultimately, it seems related to the foundational issue that there's such a wide-held view that vaccines are a central element of the traditional and modern-day public health system, and that they are responsible for literally saving millions of people's lives. I mean, that's the widely held view. So it's understandable how many professionals who believe that truly would be violently opposed to some of the messages that we're both promoting. But the reality is they haven't really carefully examined the numbers and the statistics and really the truth behind the information that's really being disseminated by for the most part, conflicted drug companies who are really spreading information that's going to promote the sale of these pharmaceuticals.
Well, I agree with you. I think that certainly when the smallpox vaccine was developed, people were so afraid of smallpox, and it was something when they declared it was eradicated in 1979 from the Western Hemisphere. We saw this, I think, sort of commitment by public health that they were going to try to do the same thing with every other infectious disease that afflicts man. So there has been sort of this idea that the cornerstone of public health and individual health as well must be that we control or eradicate infectious diseases through the mass mandated use of vaccines. But what they never have bothered to do, really, is take a step back and say, is that a wise thing to do? Because we did it with smallpox, because we did it with polio, is it a wise thing to do with every single microorganism that causes infections in humans? And we're at the point now where we have 69 doses of 16 vaccines the government recommends every single child should get from day of birth through age 18. We now have a universal use influenza vaccine policy that every single American from 6 months of age through the year of death is to receive a flu vaccine every year. But what we don't have is large studies that show that that policy is safe, particularly for every person. Not only safe, but also effective. Are we really achieving greater health in our society on an individual basis and a public health basis by using so many vaccines? And I would argue that the jury is definitely out, because we have seen this explosion of chronic disease and disability in our society in the last quarter century, particularly since we've used so many vaccines. And I know you agree with me on that.
Yeah, well, specifically like the flu vaccine, which is relatively only recently recommended, and I'm not sure of the status with respect to mandated or not. If it's, you could address that. But this whole issue of there's the issue of effectiveness and safety, as you mentioned, and I think that there are emerging studies, and more the ones that I review show that in fact it is not effective at all. It just doesn't simply doesn't work in large segments of the population, and that doesn't even address the safety issue. So, and then you've got the safety issue for that, not only that vaccine, but the interaction of all those multiple vaccines, especially when they're given at such an early age to a child or an infant who is at a particularly precarious stage of their development and really more predisposed to developing complications.
The first dose of vaccine in this country is given at 12 hours of age in the newborn nursery.
It's just tragic.
It's the first immunological experience after being born, is an atypical presentation of a microorganism, lab-altered microorganism, hepatitis B. And the studies, there were hardly any studies done in newborn infants prior to this policy being instituted in 1991 by government. It's really tragic that the science was not done to buttress that policy. And I think that when going back to the original issue of the American Academy of Pediatrics trying to put pressure on CBS to take down this 15-second spot that said get educated about vaccines. You know, where are the pediatricians in questioning the policy of giving every newborn baby their first vaccine at 12 hours of age, when historically in this country we've had a very low incidence of hepatitis B, and certainly very low in terms of children with hepatitis B. I don't think that there's a balance that's been achieved here.
And there's no common sense applied to this recommendation and implementation, because the risk factor for hepatitis B would be being born to a mother who has the active infection. And you could check the mother to know if that situation exists. You don't have to give this innocent child an immunization, or they're going to be exposed to intravenous contaminated drugs or needles, or having sex. Now, a newborn child is not going to have any of those risk factors. So why would you possibly ever justify giving a child, a newborn, this dose, this is immunization, especially since even their own studies show that the benefits, protective benefits, if they exist, disappear after 10 years, which is prior to the risk factors being implemented.
That's exactly right. There's no detectable antibody for vaccine strain hepatitis B antibodies in the blood after 7 to 10 years. So just as children are getting into adolescence, they're basically going to be vulnerable again. So you're right, for a very small minority of babies born in this country to hepatitis B positive mothers, they instituted a universal use vaccine policy for all 12-hour-old newborns, not knowing the immune or the neurological or immunological status of that baby after birth. How much do you know about a baby 12 hours after birth? You really know hardly anything.
Yeah, it would seem far wiser just to screen all the pregnant women to see if they have the infection.
And more cost effective as well.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, the hepatitis B test has to be less effective than hepatitis B series of immunizations.
And I think cost effectiveness is something that really needs to be looked at in this economic climate that we're in.
Absolutely.
What kind of healthcare dollars do we spend? What do we spend our healthcare dollars on? Is it more and more vaccines? And is that translating into better health for our children and adults? And I think that's a big question.
So ultimately it comes back to the issue of education. Does the typical average parent of a newborn understand this? And that was really the thrust of the message that you were seeking, is to help people get educated. It wasn't really throwing rocks and say, just get informed, make your own decision. Don't rely on these external influences that are heavily influenced by conflict of interest. To rely on them as your only source. So what is your impression as to the status of the typical parent in this country with respect to their knowledge base or awareness of the real central issues that are involved?
Well, we do know from recent polls in the last few years that the majority of parents now are concerned about both vaccine safety and prescription drug safety. We also know that about 2/3 of Americans believe that doctors are too heavily influenced by pharmaceutical companies and pharmaceutical company lobbyists. I would also add to that a lot of legislators, unfortunately at the state and federal level, are also influenced by the pharmaceutical lobby, which actually on Capitol Hill is the biggest lobby on Capitol Hill. So I think that this growing concern, that they know that there's something potentially that they need to know, but I don't think that the basic educational level for most new parents is there when it comes to infectious diseases and vaccines. And so that's really what our organization has always been about. As you say, we don't tell people what to do. We're consumer advocates. We're not doctors. Mm-hmm. We don't tell people to vaccinate or not to vaccinate. What we say is, as an educated healthcare consumer, you must understand the risks associated with the diseases as well as the vaccines and make an informed decision. Because you know what? As a parent, you live with that decision. You have to take responsibility for it, because your doctor and your legislator and your pharmacist, nobody's going to live with it. You're going to live with it. And I think this idea that we ought to have the right and the freedom in this country to have information and make voluntary decisions, I believe it's a human right, I think it's a civil right, and I think it's something worth standing up for in the 21st century.
I think that's the central issue, isn't it? Is the ability to have this freedom of choice, which is, you know, there are many thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who've lost their lives in their countries defending that freedom. And you know, many of us nowadays don't have any necessarily personal experience with really the loss of freedom and what that is. But we see this emerging risk, and starting at this level where there's this, the government knows better mentality and mandating these recommendations that may have in fact significant harms, and not allowing the individual their right to make that decision themselves or for their children.
I totally agree with you. It's one of the reasons that I'm very grateful for and excited about the partnership that NVIC has with Mercola.com, because I believe that you have been a pioneer as well in the holistic healthcare movement in this country, which is seeing at least a third to 40% of Americans moving toward what I call the new paradigm, the new health paradigm, which is not so based in pharmaceutical product use, which is more natural in its approach, which is a less toxic approach to staying healthy. And I think that the vaccine safety and informed consent movement is very much at the center of this holistic health paradigm shift. Mm-hmm. But there are those who are in control of the old paradigm, the pharmaceutical-based paradigm, who are not happy with the shift, and they're trying to hold it back. I think they're trying to hold health back. I think that they're jeopardizing health liberty. I think that we're going to have to, those of us who understand, who want to eat organic, who want to have natural ways to stay healthy, who want to make vaccine choices, we're going to have to stand up and fight really hard in this second decade of the 21st century, or we're going to lose that freedom. Yeah. And government will come down on people, and they will demonize people and make it impossible to function in society unless you conform. I mean, America was built by dissenters with a healthy respect for minority views. Why should we be thrown off of a Times Square ad when we were only advocating informed choices, informed healthcare choices? This is very frightening in a way that you can't simply say get educated.
Well, fortunately, the company that owned the billboard had integrity, and you had a contract, and you were not thrown off.
We were not thrown off.
So, but you created this controversy, which I think is kind of like turning lemon into lemonade. We were able to leverage and inform more people than really, because the intention of the sign was not to necessarily bring attention to ourselves, but bring attention to the issue of really education, and that extra exposure that we had really made a huge difference. So that's a really benefit of this, is that as we bring attention to the issue and get more exposure in the media, then more people become aware of the issues and can investigate themselves. But you're right that the biggest part of the central issue is that there's so many hundreds of billions of dollars at stake. And it's not that these companies, these pharmaceutical companies in agriculture and farming organizations are necessarily committed to causing people to become sick and die prematurely. I don't believe that's their intention in any way, shape, or form. But it seems to be an unintended consequence of their commitment to really bottom line profits.
Right.
And collectively, the drug companies have $500 billion in annual revenues they generate every year. And that provides enormous amount of power and influence, enough to fund the largest lobby on Capitol Hill, and which changes the laws, which funds the government, and really generates the recommendation, these mandated vaccine policies, which essentially become a requirement, because for most parents to allow their children to access the public health school system or public school system, they need to show demonstration of these vaccines, and you know, these exemptions are at risk, because we have some philosophical exemptions, and the new term is conscientious beliefs, and then of course medical exemptions
and religious
exemptions. but they're being limited. But ultimately, I think, with this type of information, the over 3 decades of work you've done and really documented and support that you're providing, and the internet, and really the advent of social networking technology, and the explosion of people to interconnect and really share information almost at a moment's notice. I mean, it's really, the whole culture has changed. So I think it's really exciting. Yes, we have enormous challenges.
Yes,
I mean,
we do.
it's hundreds of billions of dollars of powerful influence. So it literally is a David Goliath situation. So I'm really excited about heralding this movement that is inevitable, because to any objective observer of the U.S. economy, I mean, it's just being crippled, and there are many people who believe that the dollar is just going to evaporate into nothingness, and we're going to have a massive change, which is really the foundational financial structure of this country, and that's going to cause us to more seriously, more carefully reevaluate every single amount of resources we're investing in something, and eventually they're going to figure it out. This is the greatest opportunity for natural health, because we know it works. The truth is going to emerge. There's just no question it's going to emerge.
If it's allowed to emerge in terms of, if mainstream media will cover this. I mean, you have a huge voice through the Mercola.com newsletter. We have a voice through our newsletter and through the video blogging we do. But it's going to take an awareness by mainstream media and a return to the old way journalism used to be conducted, which is you cover both sides of the story. You don't just cover the side that government approves of or the pharmaceutical companies approve of. You actually look at it intellectually from both the challenge as well as the defense, because this is about a challenge of the old paradigm and those who are defending the old paradigm.
Well, I really think that we have this sort of almost magical 21st century workaround that traditional media exposure, and yes, it would accelerate and catalyze if they were to accept this message and broadcast it more widely, but the networking of the bloggers and through Facebook and Twitter and social media can get that message around them.
I agree, but do you think there's all sorts of talk on the internet now about restrictions on certain kind of information that is going to be applied by government? Do you think that that's a possibility in the
anything's
future?
a possibility, but I think there would be such a violent opposition to this that it would really be very interesting times if that occurred.
I agree.
I think the genie's out of the bottle at this point, and it's just very difficult to go back. And my guess is that if they had any idea that this was going to have this type of impact, that there would have been, early on, they would have implemented some very specific restrictions to prohibit it from ever getting to this point where it is now. But once it's at this point, people know that once you know, you can't unknow something.
Well, you can't unring a bell, can you?
Yeah, you can't. And I think it really has been wrong. And really the infrastructure's in place, so I mean, it'd have to have some massive, catastrophic clampdown or a war or something that would devastate the infrastructure. But the infrastructure's already there. And obviously they can turn it off like they did in China and in other countries, but
that's not America. I mean, you can't
no.
even
I mean,
imagine
if it gets to that point, then
it's
interesting. It'll be interesting.
But I agree with you. I think that the opportunity we have in the 21st century with technology to get out information that mainstream media will not carry, which is too bad. But I think you're right. I think that's where the education of America, and indeed the world, is going to take place on the World Wide Web.
So I think it's a very powerful note to conclude on, is that we can make a difference. We are making a difference, and I believe fully that the truth will emerge. And it's really interesting too that there's a general principle is that you tend to attract to you. It's sort of the law of attraction, more in your life of what you put your focus on. So if you focus on disease, like vaccinations, or I'm concerned about hepatitis or meningitis, well, you're going to get more of that. But if you focused on health,
wellness,
and improving your health, you don't have to worry about disease. Your body will take care of it. It's a non-issue because our bodies are designed to stay healthy. Now, clearly we need experts and coaches to help us guide us through this, because there's a lot of little subtleties and genetic aberrations and toxins and stuff that we need to be aware of that require expert assistance. But ultimately, even with that expert assistance, it's the body that does all the magic work. So if we give
can
the
just help the body do what
just
it naturally
just
does.
nourish it, I mean, just support it a little bit and coach it through. It takes care of it, and we don't have to worry about these diseases. And literally, you know, for the bulk of these benefits, that's perceived benefits of the vaccine programs over the last century or so, really the majority of the benefit most likely was facilitated through areas of lifestyle and healthy living and hygiene that really catalyzed this improvement in the public health rather than specific vaccine implementations.
Well, there are actually studies that support that. That there are definitely that the sanitation improvements, that the improvements in the overall way that we live were really more responsible for the decline in the mortality associated with infectious disease. I look back at measles in the 60s. There were still hundreds of thousands of cases of measles in this country before the vaccine was introduced in the 60s. But we weren't seeing death in the way that we were seeing it and have seen it in some of the underprivileged countries where they don't have any sanitation to speak of, where they have poor quality of food, where they have all kinds,
not even enough food. They don't have
not
calories.
enough food,
Protein,
right.
calorie malnutrition.
Yeah. So I mean, you really have to take a step back and look objectively at what does good health mean. It does not necessarily mean more drugs and more vaccines, and that's why you know, I'm always delighted to have these conversations with you because we think very much alike, and I think that education is where it's at, and I think that we're going to do a lot in the next 5 years to increase education.
Well, we're just catalysts. So ultimately, it's everyone watching and listening to this is really going to do the work. There's no question about it. We are, I mean, there's nothing magical about what we're doing. We're just providing you the information. You can make the choice. And more importantly, to empower yourselves, your own personal networks, to get active, to educate your relatives, your neighbors, your co-workers, and not to become overly evangelical about it, but to just provide them with basic information so that they can make an informed choice and really have the opportunity to choose, not necessarily be dictated or mandated to.
Because I think if you make a voluntary, considered choice, you own it. And when you own it, you can defend it. And if you can defend it, you'll be able to preserve the right to make it. So it all begins with that conscious, informed choice. And I totally agree with you.
Okay. Well, are there any last words you'd like to provide?
I think we said
That's a good note to end on. And thank you for watching. And remember, it's all about the information, the education, and really let me encourage you to take an active role. If you haven't really participated in this is an important issue to you, I believe it should be, then really all it takes is connecting with a few people. If you can connect with one or two people and everyone does that, you're going to change the entire future of the world.
The planet.
There's no question. So you can make a difference. You can take control of your health. So get in there and let's work together to make a difference, and so everyone can take control of their health.